Hey everybody, this is Tim Chavez from Faith Matters. Today we're excited to announce the latest offering from Faith Matters Publishing, following our previous books, All Things New by Fiona and Terryl Givens, Restoration by Patrick Mason, and Better Than Happy by Jody Moore. This book is called The Mother Tree, Discovering the Love and Wisdom of Our Divine Mother, and it was written by Kathryn Knight Sonntag. It is a truly beautiful book and a great read. The timing of this release is interesting. First, we're coming up on Mother's Day, and we love that this book is a profound recognition of our Divine Mother. Second, Elder Renlund of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles recently gave an important talk to the women of the church on the doctrine of Heavenly Mother. While celebrating with us this unique doctrine, he also had words of caution about demanding further revelation on Heavenly Mother theology, among other things. Though this book was obviously completed well before that recent address, it strikes us as very much in the same spirit. It is a celebration of our unique doctrine, which is beautifully outlined in the Church's Gospel Topics essay on Heavenly Mother. But the book values experiencing her presence in the world and in our lives over theological speculation. It is about how accessing different ways of knowing, through the languages of art, nature, poetry, and stillness, can lead to a personal relationship with our Divine Mother. And it points to the surprising ways in which, as the Church's essay points out, she has always been there in our scriptures. So today, we spoke with the author of The Mother Tree, Kathryn Knight Sonntag. Kathryn's book of poetry, The Tree at the Center, was a 2019 Association for Mormon Letters Awards finalist. Her poetry and essays have appeared in many publications, including Colorado Review, Rock and Sling, and Dialogue. She holds a master's degree in landscape architecture and environmental planning, and works as a landscape architect and freelance writer in Salt Lake City. And just a few notes on the book's logistics. As of today, the Kindle version is available on Amazon, but the book is just coming off the printing press, and it will be a few weeks before you can buy the print version there. That said, we know that many of you will want a physical copy of the book for Mother's Day, so we've set up a special shipping operation where you can buy the book and have it shipped to you right away. In order to do that, head to faithmatters.org/themothertree. That's all lowercase, no hyphens or spaces. You'll be sent straight to a product page where you can buy the book. And Faith Matters is paying the cost of shipping for all U.S. customers, so it's free for you, and so that nothing gets in the way if you'd like to have this book as a gift in time for Mother's Day. Okay, that's it for now, and we hope you enjoy this conversation with Kathryn and the beautiful book that she's written.
All right, Kathryn, welcome to the podcast. We are so excited about this book, and we're so excited to have you in the studio finally. So thanks for being here.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
So I want to start with a really general question. I want to talk about metaphor and why you feel like this is an effective device for exploring this topic of Heavenly Mother. It's something that we're really comfortable with when we talk about Jesus, as the Son of God, or as the Lamb of God, as the bread of life. Like that all feels normal, but this is kind of new language for Heavenly Mother. So would you talk about how you decided to take an entire book to explore a single metaphor?
Sure. I mean, going back a bit, I've always been fascinated with the tree of life. It's been a symbol that's always sort of called to me and that has had a resonance. And doing my master's work, I realized that there was this intrinsic link between the tree of life and the feminine that you see repeated in space and time throughout many cultures and traditions. And that really piqued my interest. And at the time, I was also looking into work by Margaret Barker, who's a Bible scholar who really gets into the language of the Bible and places where there's been discrepancies, translation issues, and a lot of evidence that the mother or this divine figure in the Bible has been obscured. And there's a lot of references to her as the tree of life or wisdom, and also to her place in the temple, symbolized there as the tree of life. So this is a very ancient symbol. It's not one that I just sort of felt connected to myself and made a book out of, right? It was a symbol that sort of spoke to this very deep sense of my own femininity and my own ability to sort of manifest what that looks like in a symbol. Symbols are so powerful because they take two seemingly different elements or objects or abstract ideas and shows the ways in which they actually are similar and bring out the aspects or characteristics of each in a really beautiful way. And so I think as LDS people, especially, we have a lot of experience with that, looking at parables, looking at the symbolism in scriptures, and especially the Son, right? Like looking at him as the Lamb. It's such a beautiful and tender image that he has this sort of compassion and deep sense of humility and ability to sort of follow while being the shepherd. and to sacrifice what he sacrificed. And so with the tree, I really was able to tap into the idea that the mother has this capacity that is uniquely feminine to be present on the earth and woven into the fabric of creation, while also reaching to the heavens and having this sort of divine wisdom and transcendence that we can access through that image.
Wow. Yeah.
Could you talk about, too, moving just outside of the symbol for a second, what in your life and story and background led you to search for Heavenly Mother and try to connect with her more fully?
Yeah. I was as surprised as anyone to arrive at that point. She kind of became just the next point of arrival on my trajectory, on my path. But I do looking back see sort of the experiences and the moments where she was present, but I didn't realize it was her until these last few years, where I really got into the symbolism of the tree and finding her in scripture, and sort of having that feminine landscape of the gospel opened up to me. I began sort of seeking a divinely wise female figure, I think from a young age, because I felt the lack of it. I felt like there was a lot of male-driven sort of seeking and spiritual paths, which was fine, which was great. But I wanted also like a female or feminine interpretation, not necessarily female, but perhaps a different orientation towards the world that felt maybe more innately my own understanding or orientation. And so I was kind of always on that journey, and I began to study sacred archetypal symbols for my graduate work in landscape architecture, and the Tree of Life was one of those symbols. So that's when I sort of saw these past experiences in nature, or just sort of moments when I felt the divine feminine presence in my life sort of resonate strongly in that image, and realized, oh, okay, this has layers and depths of meaning that I have not explored yet, and that are leading me to the mother. And then in becoming a mother myself, there was also that very real element of I am connecting heaven and earth by being this vessel as a tree, like the symbol of the tree. You've got the roots connecting to the world, but then you have the branches going up to the heavens. And so I felt sort of that symbol in my own body.
Wow. I want to, before we really get into the metaphor itself and talk about each parts of the tree, I want to just ask you, there was a line I think it was in the preface actually of the book, where you say that you believe that asking questions and exploring possibilities are indispensable ways to show love and reverence for revealed truth. So I would love for you to just talk about that for a minute, because I think that the story around Heavenly Mother is that we show reverence by our silence. And so would you just talk about how you kind of came to this place of feeling like this is actually the way that you can honor her?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is larger than the LDS tradition, that there's this growing hunger for the feminine, for the divine feminine, regardless, even in a secular setting, right? That there's this need for what it represents, which is also archetypal because it transcends space and time, this connection to earth, a love for understanding the purposes of creation, for being in community and communion. And that was something that really fueled sort of my desire to continue to seek her and to move along that path. And
yeah, I love that. It felt very like experiential to me, like experience driven. It felt like the experiences came first, like that experience of connection, and then the book followed. And I really love that, because I think that's something that a lot of us that will resonate with a lot of readers, and it definitely resonated with me, that instead of being given a formula for how to connect, it was like, I'm trying to explain this deep sense of connection that I feel. And of course, that is a respectful and way to honor deity.
I think that also by nature of sort of the restored gospel, just the idea of like a gospel being restored, like we're really given, I don't want to say permission, but there's this sort of openness to, you know, to seek and to learn and to grow and to do your own internal work, to kind of follow what Joseph Smith did, which is to ask questions that perhaps by institutions or by outside forces you've been told you shouldn't be asking.
Yeah. Well, and in our culture, there's also this this idea that not only should we, you know, not pray to Heavenly Mother, not, you know, try to come up with our own theology regarding her, but that we shouldn't even talk about her.
Mm-hmm.
But that's something that you, that's I think a myth that you debunk in the first few pages of the book.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, just going through the historical references, there's I believe it's over 600 references of her since 1844 by church leaders and other people in authority within the church. And so there's definitely, she's spoken of and she's understood as being central to understanding the character and nature of God and our own path of salvation, that there's not just a father, there's a mother, and they are two individual people that have two different identities, because as the father has flesh and blood, like we can assume that the mother also has flesh and blood, and that there's probably something unique that she has to offer because she is a unique individual. I think even just recently hearing in general conferences, just like the feeling that we wish we did know more about her, that there is this yearning. And I obviously offer this book with a lot of humility and reverence. I don't know everything. This is just where I am on my path. And I feel like because of its sort of archetypal nature, this sort of ability for symbols to transcend space and time, and the tree's home in the Holy of Holies in the temple, like there's something very real there that outlasts time, right? That is a part of the capital T truth that we're seeking. So yeah, I know that there's hesitancy around talking about her, and I do understand that to a certain degree, but when you're called to seek and you feel a desire to seek, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. You know, like what our hearts communicate to us and what they want us to follow, that path they want us to follow, is the most important thing that we can do. And so knowing that there's sort of this larger desire for that, even outside of our tradition, I think is a beautiful symbol, that she wants to be known, that she is a part of us, a part of our souls and our hearts.
Yeah. And I think in that, sorry, were you going to say something else?
No, go ahead.
In that BYU Studies article that you're referencing, that there were over, like you said, there were 600 times that she's been spoken about. And I think that one of the interesting points that they made was that not only do we have the example of her being spoken about, but that none of those references ever said don't speak about her, up to and including now Elder Renlund's talk. I'd be curious too, and if you don't mind getting into this, what was your reaction? I mean, maybe we should outline sort of what we took away from the talk. But I'm curious, just sort of off the top, you know, how you felt about what was said.
Yeah, some mixed feelings, to be honest. I really did appreciate the very personal interjection that he desired to know more about her. I thought that was very beautiful. And I understand also the desire to try to sort of put parameters around how we communicate about her and who she is, because she is sacred, and there, you know, from the institution's perspective, from the church's perspective, there isn't quite a lot. But even in referencing the essay that the church has put together and saying that's essentially it, there's footnotes to that essay, right? That opens up a lot up. So, you know, I think I personally feel like part of the work of the feminine and part of the work of the mother is this introspection work. There's obviously a role for an institution, a role for setting boundaries and having a certain degree of this is, this is the path with the ordinances and the covenants. But that alone is not going to save us. And the kind of work that I feel like is innately feminine doesn't mean that it's female. It's a femininity that can reside in anyone, regardless of how you identify, is to ask questions, to do the seeking work, and to be okay with discomfort in that seeking and the shadows that will come up and the real sort of difficult questioning that leaves you sometimes alone in the dark.
That's really what I heard in that talk. We were reading your book rereading it at the same time. And I just appreciated for the way that the book sort of illuminated that there are other ways of learning and gathering knowledge. And we're really comfortable with this very masculine way, which is like you talk about is really linear and goal driven, and it's measurable, and there are data points. And so I felt like it sort of gave me new ears to hear Elder Renlund's talk is maybe just pushing back. Maybe he's totally right that we need to do this the feminine way, and we're not going to get a list of bullet points about how our relationship with Heavenly Mother should look. And that's a good thing, because this is going to be, we've been talking a lot about how there has been this explosion of visual arts and poetry, and we're seeing Heavenly Mother images that are so rooted in nature. And, it just feels like that maybe that is how she is showing up. And Elder Renlund's totally right. Like, it's not going to come from the pulpit. It's going to come from the forest and from the paintbrush. And that's great. Like, that's not shutting down the conversation. That's just nudging us, in the right direction.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think one of the main guardrails that he put on was, I'm going to slaughter this, but to paraphrase, he said, reason can't supersede revelation. And I think one of the interesting things about the way that you're approaching this, and many people I think are approaching this, is that they're not approaching it through reason necessarily. Like you, and we're going to get into this, but like you use intuitive and experiential and imaginal ways of knowing. And like, it is really interesting that I think what you've done here does actually align quite a bit, with what Elder Renlund was saying. And he also, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that he also, he says that we can't force revelation. And I think a lot of that, has to do with whether or not we're trying to, impose our views on others. And what strikes me about your book is that it's very personal. Like you're not teaching others how they should think about this.
It's an invitation.
It's an invitation.
Yeah. It's an invitation to look at the tree as an image of ascent.
Right.
So it's an image that you can use, and we see this, and this is what I absolutely love, is that we have experience doing this because that image is very familiar to us from Alma and from Nephi and Lehi, right? Like, we see the tree as an image of ascent in Alma. This is something that we plant, it's something that we grow, it's something that we tend, and that it's our soul tree. So this is familiar to us, and I'm looking at this tree as a way to move through the different realms. So we look at the roots, we look at the trunk, we look at the crown, as a way to move through the rhythms and patterns of your own transformation with the mother as a guide, because she literally is, she's the image, right? Like she's the image and she's the guide. So it's just hopefully a way that you can go through a journey yourself, right? It's just sort of like a guiding you through and saying, this has been my experience and it's borne good fruit. And hopefully, the pattern can be repeated, and the pattern can be something that can bring you to a greater sense of your own divinity and a greater sense of what it looks like and feels like to have the masculine and feminine balanced, because for the whole history of our world, it has definitely been out of balance.
Yeah, exactly. let's talk about those three sections. So the book is sort of divided into this, like you said, the roots, the trunk, the crown. Is there anything you want to say generally about those three sections? Then we can just dive into, we can start with roots.
Sure. Just generally, also this division that I make is archetypal.
Yeah.
So if you don't know that word, it's just essentially like wherever you look, whether it's Norse theology, mythology, cosmology, or Celtic or Egyptian or Mayan, like you just see the tree sort of divided in those realms as realms of existence or stages of existence or planes of existence. So the roots always sort of being associated with the realm of the dead or the underworld, the trunk as like the present temporal sphere in which we live, and the branches above as like a celestial or heavenly sphere. And so the work of the tree then is to sort of move through the realms and have fluidity within the realms. So you're taking the wisdom and knowledge from the roots into your experience of mortality, and that also informs your idea of what heaven is, and vice versa, right? So it's just sort of the idea of the motion of water and sugars through a tree is also sort of that movement of knowledge and wisdom.
Yeah. Okay, that's a great introduction. Let's start with the realm of the Shadowlands, the realm of the roots. Can you talk about what you draw from this part of the tree?
Yeah. So this is a space that, in mythologies has a little more of a reference to an actual sphere outside of mortality, but for the purposes of the book, it's more sort of the realm of introspection. So the space inside of yourself where you're really looking at, how you identify in the world, what you value, what stories we've sort of piled on and interpreted, and how we've seen them, and having to do the work of sussing out what in our traditions like actually brings us to light and truth, and what perhaps comes from a delusionary world or a world of falseness or traditions that don't really tell us who we are. And so a lot of that work is difficult, and it's a way to sort of look at what is real. The line from the Book of Mormon of like, let's see things as they really are, I think begins sort of in that realm of the roots. And of course, it's sort of a cycle, right? You come back. We don't just go down there once, but we come back and sort of reassess where we are.
Yeah. So maybe this would be a good place to, can we have a reading from you? Will you do that first one for us?
Yeah. I have found that the feminine realm of the roots teaches us to face what we don't understand, not with fear, hatred, or resentment, but with acceptance, with the open heart of presence. It asks for a commitment to a reinvention as we stare into the face of what is unresolved inside us. This place of initiation can be extremely uncomfortable because of its uncertainties, unexpected pains, and the ways in which it will challenge some deeply held beliefs. The divinely feminine aspect of each of us calls for our perception of and devoted attention to the finer feelings, energies, and expressions of spirit woven throughout the living world, beckoning our souls to transgress beyond the edge of what we know so we may grow and create good fruit. It requires us to develop sovereignty, greater self-governing power and authority, before it allows us to progress on our spiritual journeys. We find the Mother waiting for us in this place of descent so that we may discover ourselves, and in doing so, begin to discover her.
I love that last line so much. And I think that this is something that there's also been a big explosion of this like drive for, I think, women especially to figure out who they are and develop a really healthy sense of self. And I love the way that you fused those and sort of invited us to see how learning that, like, facing ourselves with so much honesty is a doorway to finding this connection with a Heavenly Mother too, because I think that's something that feels like it's happening anyway, and maybe we're not even sure why. It's just like where the energy is going. And so it was so beautiful to say, like, yeah, this really is your starting place. Like, develop a self, and then that's where the work begins. And it really, and I love the image of roots being it's your foundation for all of the growth that's going to happen afterward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And is that how you saw it, or is there some other way in which this realm of exploring these difficult or darker parts of yourself or your past or whatever that is distinctly feminine? Like how is that the work of something in which the mother might be involved? Sure.
I think for me, a lot of it, like the attachment to like a feminine descriptor is just essentially that it is sort of this cyclical networking work, right? That if we think about a tree, there's incredible things that happen in the root zone. It connects to other trees around it. It connects to a network of fungi. It connects to species that aren't its own in an effort to sort of make community and create community. And for me, I find that to be a feminine trait. It doesn't mean that only women experience that.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But that it is something that drives from an orientation that is feminine. And so the work of the roots has to be communal as well, right? Because we are connected to everyone. We're connected to everything, even if sort of the way we live in our world largely sort of separates us from those networks, that we're not so or not as connected as perhaps our ancestors were, but there's still those deep connections. And I think the mother helps us realize that sort of the false notions created in the world, that there is hierarchy, that there is power above rather than power with. I think she's really behind us grasping what that means.
There's a part where you talk about the image of Christ in the garden and on the cross, and you kind of suggest that the mother is there, and in a way that maybe we've been blind to before. And that felt really important to me right now, because one of the reasons that it's always been given that we don't pray to Heavenly Mother is that we're following the example of Christ. And so the book was already written, and I just loved like thinking back that this is a way to follow Christ's example, that he is literally leaning on the strength of the mother. So could you talk about those images and just how you see Heavenly Mother show up in those, what you call like his deepest descents?
Yeah, that's beautiful what you just said. It just became clear to me, like I was looking back and seeing trees and groves present in so many revelatory experiences from all the scriptures, from modern and past canonized scripture. And I just really started to draw that connection. I think beginning with the Garden of Eden as the tree of life sort of at the center, and seeing the historical sort of overlay of the temple on the Eden space, that the tree of life was at the center of Eden, but also at the center of the temple, that there was the menorah there representing the mother, and that sort of that space of transcendence, right? That was the holiest space. That was where you encountered divinity. That was where you, according to many scholars, began to understand the paths of everything that lives. So there was an innately feminine aspect to that as well. And it was sort of opened this space of possibility, right? That the feminine is in our world, that she is in the land itself and in the earth, and that part of the heritage that we have here in a world that will be celestialized is the mother's presence.
Yeah. When we were discussing this before recording, like Aubrey said, we've been encouraged repeatedly, including in Elder Renlund's talk, to pray to the Father. But there must be ways to connect with Heavenly Mother, right? And I'm trying to remember. You do mention forest bathing in the book, don't you?
Not directly,
oh
but
there's
definitely
you sent
references.
him on a.
I am so sorry.
On a quest.
After I read your book, I became interested in the concept of forest bathing, which was something that I had heard about. Have you heard about this?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And I've read now a book on it, and it's absolutely incredible, the mental and physical health benefits that one can gain from just spending time among trees.
Mm-hmm.
Like this has been, it came out of Japan, which obviously is a country that maybe more so than where we live here in the desert, is covered in beautiful forests of all different types of trees. And now there have been, I mean, not to get too like rational about it, but like there have been like all these scientific studies now. You guys like, okay, yeah, man would go here, but like that show like people spend just 2 hours, walking among the trees, and they'll either measure like specifically like things going on in their blood levels, or just take like mood assessments,
Mm-hmm.
and the benefits are just astounding. And it really resonated, I thought, with your book. I think the same thing could be drawn on the other side. If you looked at the benefits of prayer and meditation, and say we're not seeing the full picture unless we're sort of connecting with the divine, the masculine and the feminine divine, in sort of all of these different ways.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. And that's kind of like reflected my own personal experience. Like I would say, well, until I sort of went on this journey with the mother, prayer was absolutely essential to me. And I was religious about it every night, every morning, and had incredible experiences, like an incredible surety that prayer was something that I could rely on to get a greater vision of who I was and who was up there, right? And my purpose and my path. And it still is, but I found that when I started to seek for the mother, and not just the mother, right? Like this whole path for me began when I wanted to just sort of understand myself more and understand what this feminine realm was that was opening up to me through becoming a mother, that I needed other avenues. I needed other ways of connecting, and being in nature, being out on my own in solitude was always something I loved, but it became very necessary at that time. Meditation as well, and like just a whole bunch of things that were not prayer, not the
Mm-hmm.
kind of prayer that we've been taught to do, at least. And so that was a beautiful sort of intersection and a way to sort of weave together different ways of experiencing divinity.
Yeah. Would you do that second reading and
Sure.
share one of those experiences?
I have felt the presence of the mother in some of my most difficult descents. In the first trimester of my second pregnancy, I miscarried. A close friend came to offer comfort, and I found myself unable to speak about what had happened. I had no words. After she left, all I wanted was to be flat on my back on the earth. I laid down under the crab apple tree in my front yard. I felt my breathing slow and my body relax. I attended only to the presence of the tree, its undulating branches, red fruit, and peeling bark. As I held the moment in my soft gaze, the energy of its living form filled my knowing, and somehow I was found by the tree. I felt it aware of my presence, and in that mutual acknowledgement, a communion of some significant way. I was embraced in the tree's knowing that everything was, and that was enough.
Thank you. I just, maybe to kind of wrap up Roots, I felt like what I loved most about this section was just this idea that our extreme pain, mental anguish a lot of times, is useful, is a useful part of our work in this ascent. And I love that experience that just illustrates how in a moment of your deepest pain, there was also this presence, which is always there. And I loved recognizing that as something so valuable that can really be invisible to us. Almost, it's like we need language to make it visible. So I felt like this was such an important section, and maybe my favorite. Anything else about Roots? Can we move on to Trunk?
I just wanted to say within this section, I think we're not really trained to just be. It's not really a part of how we, maybe our worldview or sort of what we value or how we sort of feel like we should be spending our time, just like that idea of spending time itself, right?
Maybe as like modern people, as Americans, and even as Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thank you for the framing. Yeah. Because I don't want to be too general, but there is an incredible sense of continuance and connection that comes so strongly from nature when you're able to just be in presence and experience bodily, that moment. And it is a kind of peace and a kind of divinity that is always there and that needs that sort of care and attention from us. And so that's been a huge sort of compliment to prayer in that sense that, like sometimes we feel like we've got to wait a while for an answer to a prayer, or we feel like the message isn't, the communication is not happening, we're reaching out and we're not receiving. For me, like being in those spaces, it's always there.
That's really beautiful. All right, let's move to trunk, where we manifest new ways of being. Do you want to give us sort of an overview of this section of the tree?
Sure. So the trunk, again, is the realm of sort of our mortal world and experience, and where we kind of actualize the things that we've learned about through our introspective work. And so, we're able to sort of look inside and say, wait a minute, like perhaps this thing that I thought I wanted, or this belief that I had, maybe that doesn't really resonate with me, and maybe something else would be a better expression in the world, whether at home or at work or wherever, of what is authentically me and what is therefore like more authentically divine.
Okay, yeah. And this, I had to keep reminding myself, like it's still cyclical. It's not like this is a period of your life necessarily. Like this is something that you experience, and then you dip back into the realm of the roots, and then you create something with that again. And it's hard to like, even, as a woman, like it's really hard to embrace that way of learning, this like this cyclical ascent.
Yeah. I think, again, like the way that we're structured sort of in society and even, just like the way that we have to go through our day, we miss the rhythms of nature. We miss the rhythms of like those connections, because we're taught from a very young age, like at least, we'll talk about America. We'll talk about like a Western frame of mind that progress is linear. There's there's ways, things you can check off your list. There's a way sort of forward that's very direct. Yeah.
And which is why the tree, I think, is so useful, because you talk about how it sort of intertwines both. And I think that even just that the image itself brings a lot of peace, because it's scary if you really believe you're on this linear trajectory, because then when you know that you're in the Shadowlands, then you think what that means is you've regressed.
Yeah.
And so the idea of it being cyclical is such a gift, because you can understand that to mean growth, and that when you're in despair or really feeling challenged or experiencing a lot of dissonance, you can believe that this is a new opportunity to grow, and that you're not in the same place. It's just, this is part of this continuous cycle of ascent.
Yeah. And I love the image of an upward spiral for that reason, because you do have the directionality, but then you have this sort of like woven spiraling motion that sort of takes you up and down, back and forth, but you're never back at the place that you were. You're always sort of moving in a direction.
Yeah. I love that image.
This this same concept is something Brian McLaren talks about in Faith After Doubt. If you remember, he has sort of a framework for faith stages that I found really useful. That he calls the 4 stages: simplicity, complexity, perplexity, and harmony. And I think a lot of people, when they think about Fowler stages of faith generally, they kind of think about, okay, from 0 to 20 I was in stage 2 or whatever, and then 20 to 30 stage 3, and it's like, but that's in the way Brian explains it, is that it is cyclical. And after harmony, you find yourself in sort of this new version of simplicity, and then later into a new version of complexity again. And I think it can be kind of like you were alluding to, Aubrey, like it can be discouraging to think that you should be in one place and find yourself, quote unquote, having regressed. But really it is, I love the imagery that you add here, that it's this upward cycle, which is something just the metaphor of the tree, if you think about it cross-sectionally, it just lends itself to so well.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Can we talk just for a minute about how community comes into play in this spiraling ascent? Is this something that you can do alone, or do you think that we need community for this part?
I mean, I definitely think community is key, right? Like we're on this path within our tradition of trying to reach Zion. That's sort of our, the ultimate stage of development, I would say. And so we have to learn the things we need to learn in context of each other in relationships. So what is it to be jealous? What is it to be mad? What is it to be joyful? Those are concepts we can't fully grasp as an individual alone, and how to reconcile pain, how to heal from wounds, how to forgive, like all of these things require each other. And so there's a very sort of equalizing force, I would say, or orientation that the mother brings, that we're here together, we're all in this together, and any sort of hierarchy that we make is a false construct, because ultimately, we're not saved without each other.
Yeah, that is the hardest part. Yeah. Like it's really easy to be forgiving without someone to forgive, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah,
for sure.
Let's talk about, we've kind of touched a little bit on this, but I want you to just say more about how physically being in nature has been part of this journey for you, because I feel like this is sort of, we think of being outside and in the natural world as sort of like just a bonus, when you have time, and it's a way good for your mental health. And it was so clear that like, this is so central to your spiritual practice. And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that, because it's something that is not prescriptive at all. Like we don't really have ritual around being outside. And so I think it's easy for that to sort of fall away as something less important that you do when all of the real work is done. So can you just talk about how, and I understand that like we are talking about a metaphor, but at the same time, it just seems like this image of the tree in real life has been so important to you. So can you just talk about how in real life this has mattered to your connection?
Yeah. I think some of the most sacred moments I've had have been out alone in nature, entering that space with some really difficult questions or feelings or unresolved issues, things that, have lasted for years, things that I just will never resolve or haven't resolved yet. And being there, I feel a very direct, sacred link to creation. And creation for me is a manifestation of deity. It's what they've created. It's their world. Like this is what they decided to do with their creative powers, was to make a tree, was to make a wolf, was to make like this crazy network of fungi that we are just barely beginning to understand, like how incredibly intricate and sensitive it is. And there's just something intrinsically good and true and beautiful and full of life and eternal life, because nature is about connection and bonds. And we know from D&C that this earth lives a celestial law. So we are literally, we're amongst deity in that sense. So what do we have to learn? Like, what do we have to offer that isn't, let's come and extract what we need without really fully understanding what we're taking and from whom we're taking. And, this is promised to be our celestial home. So what can it teach us now, living a celestial law? Like, how can it teach us about our own divinity and, the light of Christ, the light of truth woven through everything, and Christ being the fruit of the mother and the father, they're woven through it as well.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's such a beautiful way to put it. Could you do that third reading for us before we finish with the trunk?
It's a little long.
That's great, though.
The vertical axis of the trunk symbolizes a bridge between our fledgling knowledge and the divine wisdom of the heavens above. Our earthbound wisdom is gathered in the realm of the trunk, which leads us to celestial understandings. So while in our root work we strive to relieve our souls of things that may cause harm, we are always in the process of uncovering our true selves, of moving toward wholeness and greater understanding, reckoning at the roots that affects the health of our trunk and branches. As we continue to access the healing powers of the divine, we see more and more clearly the reality of our lives. In this way, Mother God teaches that wisdom is not knowing more, but knowing with more of you, knowing deeper. Tapping into divinely feminine traits with the guidance of our mother creates a grounding and depth to our experience of the world and of ourselves. She calls us to a deeper state of awareness. Our senses become heightened. We hear more acutely and see more sincerely into the truth of all things. Importantly, we learn to trust our bodily experiential wisdom. We begin to understand the balance of the divinely feminine and divinely masculine aspects of ourselves, as we learn how the mind, spirit, and body intersect. As we learn to weave these different intelligences together, we come to see that we are here on earth to deepen our souls in an act of co-creation with divinity.
Thank you. I would love for you to respond to someone who's worried that this exploration of Heavenly Mother is going to sort of further our heteronormative understanding of God. So how do you, I love the language that you use in this last reading about weaving together masculine and feminine energies. And I understand that you're talking about something that's happening inside each of us. Mm-hmm. So what do you say to someone who's tiptoeing because they're worried that this could somehow be painful?
Sure. It's a difficult subject because we have sort of in the context of patriarchy, which is the context in which we all live, looked at Heavenly Mother and Heavenly Father with certain gender roles in mind. And I think part of this work of introspection that she asks us to do is to reevaluate what is truly masculine and what is truly feminine, and what does it mean inside an individual, inside a relationship, on a larger like church level, institutional level, social level, political level, right? Like there's so many ways to sort of reassess what's happening, and I don't see like this divinely feminine figure as, female the way that we see female and white, or with all of these certain characteristics. More than anything, I see it as a symbol of, or perhaps sort of the quintessential example of some of these traits that we're talking about, being interconnected, being full of abundance and regeneration, right? A life-death-life cycle. And so that is something that anyone can feel inside of themselves, regardless of how you identify, and sort of acknowledge the source of that as being feminine or masculine. I don't particularly like those words for me to a certain degree are just like placeholders, like the larger idea of like a yin yang sort of approach of like there are sort of aspects inside of ourselves that need harmonizing, and there are some ancient archetypal sort of ways in which we have always seen masculine and feminine, and that's what I'm trying to show in the book, that these aren't within my cultural context as like, white LDS woman living in Utah in 2022, right? Like I've gone back to see what across space and time has resonated and remained, that we still sort of attach And I know that obviously changes within certain cultural frameworks, but there are some underlying attributes that still sort of have continued to be relevant.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Anything else you want to add about the trunk before we move on?
I don't think so.
Okay. Should we do the crown?
Yeah, the crown. So tell us about the crown.
So the crown is sort of, for me, one of the most like interesting and fun parts of the book, in the sense that like it's the most like ambiguous. Like, this is the realm of the divine. This is the realm of divine wisdom, and for the purposes of our book, like a uniquely feminine wisdom. And I've really loved looking into some apocryphal texts, the Book of Wisdom, or the Book of Solomon as it's known, and looking at very specific language around wisdom, which has a feminine personification with very specific roles and attributes and purpose in salvation. And that's been really incredible to look at. Like, what does it mean to sort of arrive at a divine wisdom, or at lady wisdom, right, as she's referred to sometimes. And so this is sort of the place where we see it unfold. It's sort of like a emergent realm. It's a realm that kind of grows and expands as we grow and expand. And so it's revealed sort of line upon line what that realm is and how it manifests.
Yeah. This may be an interesting place to ask. I think of myself, for example, as like a missionary, who was fairly well versed in the scriptures, but maybe at a somewhat a superficial level. I would have said at that point in my life that Heavenly Mother is entirely absent from scripture. Your book disputes that notion, I think, somewhat. For anybody that's curious, could you talk about where you find Heavenly Mother in scripture?
Yeah. I mean, she's there most sort of clearly in the book of Proverbs, named as a tree of life or wisdom. And there are many texts that, capitalize that W, and that really, I think, makes a difference. And then she's also in a lot of Old Testament texts, but it's a little trickier, right? You need more of a map to sort of find those pieces. And scholars like Margaret Barker have really done that work to sort of look at the ancient languages and look at the most ancient records and say, okay, like there's sort of evidence here that things were tampered with or taken out, or that this Hebrew word could have actually been this and would have actually made more sense having like a feminine pronoun or things like that. So I've tried to do, I'm obviously not a biblical scholar, but I have done quite a bit of research and read quite a bit of books by those who are, and it just became clear to me when you have certain elements in place that this sort of feminine landscape opens up in the scriptures. So I would definitely like send people to Margaret Barker, to her scholarship, and say that that's a really great starting point to sort of see where else in scripture. I think too, we have her pretty clearly in the Book of Mormon, like there as the tree of life from Lehi's vision, and the association that Nephi makes between her being the tree and Christ as the fruit, I think is very real. Like he would have been a contemporary of Josiah and the purges and the first temple. Like all of that would have been within his time frame, and he would have been familiar with the mother in the temple, that there was a deity, a female deity in the Holy of Holies, represented as a tree. Like that would have been within his framework. So there's a lot there once you really start to delve in. And I think that's the beauty of the feminine landscape, is once you sort of have some of these pieces in place, it really is like this incredible lush forest. It's not this desert with like one or two pieces of information. It really is like this whole landscape opens up, and there's so much. Like literally in one book of Margaret Barker's, I'm like, I could spend my whole life studying this and not fully access it.
Yeah. So
that really has given me sort of that more concrete framing that I think people want.
Yeah.
But also the inner work, right? Like you pair that obviously with the inner work of saying, do I honor the feminine in the world? Like, in what ways do I honor it? I think that's sometimes difficult for men and women, or anyone on that continuum. Like, there's a real tendency in our world to sort of discredit and mute or silence what is purely feminine.
Yeah. I liked seeing, I like this idea that it's so lush, and that because it seems like what happens then is that people come to the table with their gifts, and as soon as they realize that it's so lush, it's then they start bringing Heavenly Mother to the conversation through their gifts. And I think it's always been that way, you know, as early as we have, you know, in our own tradition with Eliza R. Snow, that like she was a poet and that's how she brought Heavenly Mother. And thank goodness, because that was the catalyst of so many conversations since then. But I think that we're seeing that right now. Like you in your first book of poetry about Heavenly Mother, I felt that too, that this is the way that you could offer her to the community, and people are doing it in whichever way feels like home to them. And I just love that this book felt like it validated those ways of knowing, that we don't need to wait for a prescription to come in a talk. This is how we are going to be a church that recognizes and values Heavenly Mother. It's going to be through the gifts of her children. So yeah. I liked the vision of this crown, and that it's like this imaginal space where those gifts really start, you know, bearing fruit, and fruit not for ourselves, because that feels, there's something life-giving about really using your gifts to connect to God, but also because it's something that can be given to the rest of our community.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
I would love for you to just take a second and talk about creativity, because I there's somewhere where maybe it's in the trunk section where you talk about that creativity is the most direct line to connecting to God. So would you just talk about how you see that? Why
Sure.
is that so connecting, in the same way that, you know, being in a forest and in all of that like celestial realm, you know, why is creativity similar in that sense?
Yeah. I think it asks us to weave together those different kinds of intelligences and ways of knowing, right? Like, whether it's writing poetry or painting, it's a very embodied experience that you're weaving together. For me personally, with my poetry collection, the intellectual knowledge that I gained through all of my academic work, writing an academic paper, being out in nature, all of those sacred, very embodied experiential moments, all of the moments in which things happen that are kind of inexplicable, but you know the source, right? Like, all of those moments that you don't know how to put into words. There's so many levels and different ways in which we can understand the world and what's happening. And I think, luckily, as LDS people, we are sort of familiar with that process because we're taught to seek the Spirit, but perhaps we don't emphasize that the Spirit moves through the body, right? Like, that there's this way in which we can't separate our spirit and body in this life, and there's the purposes that they are here together, working out our salvation together. And so I think creativity in that sense asks us to interweave these ways of knowing and create something, to produce something, like you said, that makes the world better, and that is sort of an act of faith, right? That you're perhaps understanding certain elements that might feel different, or not quite sure what it means to have them all woven together. But as you do the weaving, then it emerges, right? It's this very emergent quality again of like, what does it mean to create something? Like, you really don't know until you're finished, like what you're producing. And then you realize, I think, that divinity has been with you the whole time, that there's been this truth and light woven through your work that you've been able to harness, perhaps like a vessel, like you've been able to let it move through you, but then it also becomes part of you, right? Like, that it's a knowing, it's a spiritual, emotional, physical knowing that allows you to begin to sort of see life, I think, and with more opened eyes, and to see things as they really are, versus sort of the illusions that we know sort of circle around us.
Wow, yeah. I know we need to start wrapping up, but I loved when you talk about that the body is inherently wise, not inherently sinful, and that felt like one more way that inviting the feminine divine into our conversation can really be healing for us, because when we're rejecting our bodies and that really intuitive knowing, I think it gets really complicated to connect to God if we're constantly parsing out feelings in our brains and the spirit, like that just that's really hard. It feels like the opposite of the peace that comes from just like complete presence and acceptance of whatever is happening in our bodies. But I'm curious, how that actually shows up for you, like when you're honoring your body as something that's supremely wise, like how does that actually look different than this paradigm that it's something that you have to resist?
It's a great question. There's a lot of time I feel that needs to be spent away from stimuli and outside noise and sort of the commotion of the world, because I feel like once we do that, once we sort of spend some time, whether it's in prayer or meditation or guided imagery or in the mountains, we're opening our hearts up. We're opening our minds up. We're saying, I'm here, I'm present, and I desire connection. And at that point, a lot of work is able to be done through us. And a lot of what our bodies, our hearts, perhaps are already saying, we can actually hear. I think, just conceptually we understand this because of the Spirit, because the Spirit is a still small voice, and in many cases it's something that waits for us to be present and ready and desiring, because if we don't desire it, there's no point in its presence, right? There's nothing that it can really do to change our hearts. So I think there definitely is this need to sort of trust that because we are spirit children of heavenly parents, we have this innate divinity and it knows things. And, we come to earth innocent. We don't come to earth with a body that is full of sin. And that's a unique point of doctrine that we have that I think deserves greater sort of discussion and thought behind, that there is this way in which the body and the spirit help us to navigate in harmony together and sort of suss out what is real again and what isn't real. I really loved writing the section in the book that talks about listening to your heart. Like that was one of my favorite sections to write, because I think we think of the heart as like, oh, it's symbolic of like the things we want, the things we love, and like following our heart, and it's like this beautiful image. But like I've had experiences where it literally like told me what to do, and it was not my voice. It was like, this is like the core of who you are, and I know that. You need to know it all through you and acknowledge it in order to be on the path you need to be on. So there's no way in my mind I can separate that like knowing as like purely from one sort of source. It could be predominantly perhaps one source, but like we are integrated beings with so much knowledge flowing through us from so many different, neurological, chemical, emotional, like all of these sorts of ways of processing where we are in the world and orienting ourselves. That I just feel like Christ is the most beautiful example of what that looks like. If I had to sum it all up, I felt like what you walk away with is really this invitation for integration and harmonizing, and it's bringing so many things together, and it's not simple work, right? I think it's easier for us to think, oh well, we'll just like harmonizing feels like this really like pleasant, easy, like this is beautiful work, but it's agonizing. It asks everything of us, and not just individually, but like to build Zion, to really see what Zion is, again, an emergent quality, right? Like, we can't see it until we're actually weaving it together, until we're actually in the process of making it. Being able to sort of commit as a community to that difficult work with people we don't know very well, that are very difficult to love, or whose paradigm perhaps just feels really uncomfortable, like, that's the work.
Yeah. And I think believing that that's sanctified work is sometimes like the thing that makes it doable.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's agonizing if you think you have to stop it. But I felt like, you know, you finish and believe that this is holy work. And so that makes it worth it, at least.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Anything else that we missed that you want to add before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I think I would just add that this book has been an extremely sacred experience to write. And I'm just so grateful that it can be out in the world. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for listening, and we really hope that you enjoyed that conversation with Kathryn Knight Sonntag, author of The Mother Tree. Again, if you're listening to this in the first few days of release and you would like to buy the book to have it arrive in time for Mother's Day, head to faithmatters.org/themothertree. Again, that's all lowercase, no hyphens or spaces. You'll be taken to a product page where you can buy the book straight from us, and we're covering the cost of shipping. Thanks again for listening, and as always, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.